Welcome everyone. Uh, we're honored that you're joining us today for our webinar on how to recognize and respond to racial gaslighting. And today's webinar, as you know, is geared towards, we've done one for an academic audience. This one is geared towards a general workplace and audience in particular. And so I want to first introduce myself. So my name is Angelique Davis and my pronouns are she and her. And first of all, just in preparation for today's workshop, I want to ask you to take a moment to just exhale. And just, notice the blessing of your breath and just taking a moment to center ourselves in the fact that we're here today and that we're engaging with some really challenging material that really requires our active engagement. And so I say that because I'm always the one who needs to stop and breathe to focus. I don't know if you can relate. So today I'm co-presenting with Rose Ernst, who will present and introduce herself in a moment. And we co-authored an academic article titled Racial Gaslighting that we published in the Western Political Science Association's journal, Politics, Groups, and Identities. And last year our article won the Article of the Year award. And recently, as many of you know, the term gaslighting and racial gaslighting have become really a part of the lexicon. And so we found ourselves engaging with others not only about how to recognize it, but also how to respond. So to give you a little background, I'm an associate professor of political science and African American studies at Seattle University. I'm also a licensed attorney with expertise in employment law, and I'm a coach with what's known as the National Center for Faculty Success and Diversity. So I've coached dozens of faculty across the United States and Canada, and also have worked with clients in the employment law sector from small organizations to large Fortune 500 companies. And so this gives me a lot of insights into the type of racial gaslighting issues that we deal with on a regular basis. But most relevant to this workshop is that I am a recovering racial gaslightee. So for years, I would think, did I really just hear that? Or, right, you might relate, did they really just say that to me? But often I couldn't formulate a comeback until hours or days later. And I'd always be like, darn, So it would typically be after spending hours agonizing by myself or in conversation with friends about what had transpired. So I'm guessing some of you might be able to relate. And it was such a waste of my valuable time and energy. And so now I can say that in most instances, I respond to racial gaslighting with ease. I recognize it, I respond, and I move on. And so that's why you're here today. So you can hone your own skill set and develop your ability to recognize and respond to racial gaslighting in a way that suits you. So we also recognize that racial gaslighting is but one of the many manifestations of white supremacy, and that this hydra-headed beast is not slain with just one tactic. So our hope, however, is that through naming and interrupting racial gaslighting, our efforts can be used to further racial justice efforts rather than getting caught up in diversionary tactics of racial gaslighting. So we're dividing today's webinar into three parts. So the first, we're going to define and discuss how to recognize racial gaslighting. And then next, we're going to provide some considerations on how to respond to it. And then finally, we'll have a breakout session so that we can engage more closely with the material. I also just want to add up front that this first part of the webinar is being recorded. It's not the interactive session. It won't have your names. It's just me and Rose that will be recorded presenting the information. But the second portion where we do the breakouts is not recorded. So just wanted to let people know that up front. So before Rose gets into defining it, I also just wanted to talk about why it's so important, right? So, similar to, it is a form of racism, right? And so we know that over time, and particularly with gaslighting, people can start to believe that they actually don't trust themselves, or maybe that, they have some type of mental health problem. And it can also lead to mental health issues as well, such as anxiety and depression. So all of these have a really long-term impact, and that is why we're here today, because of how serious this is. So thanks. Rose?
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Angelique. So I'm honored to be presenting with Angelique today. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an academic editor, coach, and writer, and I left the academy last year. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about gaslighting itself and where the term comes from. So the film Gaslight in the 1940s made this term popular, particularly among psychologists who used it to refer to a particular abusive type of relationship. So following the film, Oxford English Dictionary defined gaslighting as, quote, the action or process of manipulating someone by psychological means into doubting their own sanity, which is the premise of this film, it's a great film, but it's a little bit long, and you can kind of just get the gist of it probably from that. So, psychologists have discussed this, feminists have discussed this, in particular, the work of Sylvia Burrow discusses feminism and gaslighting. She says, quote, emotional abusers often divert issues from legitimate targets by instead placing the focus on the way in which one expresses oneself. The implication is that the person raising the issue is herself inadequate to express that concern, or she is to blame for how she raised the issue. Diversion is a way of controlling the communication between persons involved. This sort of abuse is common to women's lives. Restricting freedom of expression is a similar sort of abusive tactic used to oppress groups of persons, end quote. So an example of this type of diversion is the colloquial use of the phrase tone policing, which you may all be familiar with. So in the case of tone policing, dominant groups use tone policing to chastise the communication style of people who challenge their own oppression. It focuses on the emotion behind the message rather than the message itself. So this is really key for gaslighting, is the emotion behind the message rather than the message itself, right? The content. So it's a diversionary tactic. Through focusing on the manner in which the message is delivered, no matter the legitimacy of the content, tone policing prioritizes the comfort of the privileged and minimizes people's experiences. So let's turn now to the actual term racial gaslighting and what we call racial spectacles. Okay, so Angelique and I first explored the concept of racial gaslighting to try to understand how white supremacy as a process has sustained itself over time, and particularly in the current past, let's say 20 years. So we define racial gaslighting as the political, social, economic, and cultural process that perpetuates and normalizes a white supremacist reality through pathologizing those who resist. And we'll break all this down, don't worry. Racial gaslighting relies on the creation of particular stories or narratives. These narratives are called racial spectacles. So racial spectacles are essentially stories or narratives that hide the existence or obfuscate the existence of a white supremacist state power structure. So we're political scientists, so we were really interested in how government creates and maintains white supremacy. They're visual and textual displays that tell a particular story about the dynamics of race. So racial spectacles are sometimes ongoing cultural narratives, such as endless discussions of affirmative action, which many of you may be familiar with, that generate news media stories and private conversations. And in other cases, they are momentary sort of blips just in the 24-hour news cycle that are designed to elicit racial responses. So as we're focusing on racial gaslighting today, so let's take a little more close look at some current examples, since there are unfortunately many. Turn it over to Angelique.
Right, thank you, Rose. So, we're going to first of all, we're going to talk now about racial gaslighting of BIPOC people. So, and I also want to acknowledge, right, that there's different types of racial gaslighting. So just upfront, there's at different levels. So because Rose and I, again, are political scientists, we're focusing on the structural piece, but we're also talking mostly today about the micro individual manifestations, so at the individual level of racial gaslighting. There's also, though we know, macro institutional, right, and macro societal forms of racial gaslighting as well. And so let's go ahead and start, though, with some examples that have taken place in the last 5 years. There's countless examples, so I'm just going to use a few, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these, okay? So, of course, this is the one everybody's going back to right now, right, is Colin Kaepernick on August 26, 2016, when he kneeled during the national anthem, right, before the 49ers preseason game and ignited a national debate. And by October, this had made the cover of Time magazine. And we all know how he was racially gaslighted at the micro and macro levels, right, as unpatriotic for taking a knee during the national anthem to protest police violence, right? And now we see, right, 4 years later, right, how that's changed as far as the national discussion, but, right, it ruined his football career. Another example in 2017 is during a White House ceremony honoring Navajo code talkers, 45 racially gaslit the war heroes by not only having the ceremony in front of the former President Andrew Jackson, who directed the genocide of Native Americans, but also derogatorily referred to Senator Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas. So many initially questioned the intentionality of this action and being in front of this painting. Intentional or not, it put the code talkers in the impossible position of accepting an award in that context. If they had objected during the ceremony, we can kind of imagine what the narrative would be, right? Another example just last year is during February 28th congressional testimony, the congressional testimony of Michael Cohen. Representative Rashida Tlaib expressed her concern over Representative Mark Meadows having a Black woman standing behind him during the Michael Cohen testimony. And a floor exchange ensued in which Meadows racially, he gaslighted Representative Tlaib by diverting attention to his belief that she was calling him a racist. In addition, he attempted to enlist Representative Elijah Cummings, who presided over the hearing, to also join in the attack. If you haven't seen the video, I encourage you to look up the exchange. And then just earlier this year, and it's still ongoing, right? 45 refers to COVID-19 as the Kung flu and other racist terms. Right, and so earlier this year in March, CBS News correspondent Wahia Jiang asked about the offensive nature of this term, and Press Secretary, right, McNaney, she tries to racially gaslight them and the public through claiming the media is misconstruing what 45 said, that they've been saying the same thing and it's not racist. Okay. So there's so many different examples. So I'm sure many of you can think of a number. We could go on and on. So let's talk a bit about these tactics. So some common tactics that are used. So the first one is countering, right? And so this tactic involves an abusive person questioning someone's memory of events, even though the person has remembered them correctly. So some examples, right? You're imagining things, or someone saying that's not what I intended. Another one is racism doesn't exist in this, insert your town, organization, right, school. They didn't do that to you because of your skin color. What I said was not racist, or something like, are you sure that's what really happened? So those are countering tactics. Another one is withholding. Right? So this is when someone pretends not to understand something or refuses to listen, right? And so we can also, people who keep saying, I don't understand. Also, I would put in this category those who say, oh, that would be an interesting study. We should look into this further, when there's already plenty of data, right, to support it. And so that often leads to, we should form a committee, et cetera, to look into this, right? So withholding. Another tactic is forgetting and willful ignorance. So this involves the abusive person pretending that they've forgotten something or denying something happened. So it can also include a bad faith decision to avoid becoming informed about something, to be able to avoid having to make undesirable decisions that information might prompt. And so if we think about that, there's some pretty well-known examples, such as, people who deny that the Holocaust ever took place, right? That's an example. But there's smaller examples of, well, in my opinion, I don't think they were being racist, I think. Or, I didn't know that was racist, despite having overwhelming evidence to the contrary, right? So that's one example. Another tactic is trivializing. And so this is used quite a bit, right? So making someone's concerns or feelings seem unimportant or irrational, like, oh, it's not that bad, or not everything is about race. That happened a long time ago, or it was just a joke, calm down. There's only one human race. All lives matter, or just to play the devil's advocate, right? So again, I'm guessing these are ringing familiar to many people. And there's also diverting, right? And in diverting, this is when the abusive person changes the subject or focuses on the credibility of what someone is saying rather than the content. So some people call it blocking. We talked about tone policing, right? So the goal is to criticize how a person expresses themselves in order to divert attention away from their message, right? We've heard these. You're too sensitive. Why are you so angry all the time? People of whatever group always look for excuses. Here's one. If you protested more peacefully, more people would listen to you. Blank people are racist too, right? Other people of color are racist too. And of course, classic, if we could just have a reasonable discussion, okay? So I also want to just briefly highlight, before Rose gets into talking a little bit more about this model, that racial gaslighting is different from microaggressions in that they're weaponized to pathologize. So many of you are familiar with microaggressions, right? These brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to people because of their group membership. And there's many different types of microaggressions we could get into. We have some articles by Sue and others who, get into the nitty gritty of micro insults, validations, and how those work. But while the effects of gaslighting are very similar to those of microaggressions, they function differently, right? So both can begin and seem harmless, but they build up over time and result in long-lasting consequences. And if we really think about, right, gaslighting is the action of pathologizing. Okay. All right, so now to Rose.
All right, thanks, Angelique. So this is a table from our article, and we put it together just for us to get kind of clear on how racial gaslighting functions, and also to talk a little bit about how white folks are involved, those who resist, so anti-racist allies and accomplices, how they're affected or how they're involved in racial gaslighting. So when we first started discussing this, Angelique and I had a disagreement. So I didn't think that white people could be racially gaslighted, given the fact that it's called white supremacy for a reason. And if all white people are racist on a structural level, then it didn't really make sense to me. But she insisted that white people were absolutely able to be racially gaslighted. And of course, she was right. So the point here is that it serves a different function, right? So racially gaslighting people, actually white people, serves to maintain white supremacy in a couple of different ways. So first, while white people may be pathologized, which just means that you're regarded as sort of psychologically abnormal or unhealthy, the stories about white people who resist racism are different. They're viewed as traitors to their own race. And specifically, not only traitors to their own race, but as basically resisting on the basis of something that has nothing to do with race. So for example, they would be labeled as communists, right? Or subversives. So second, the purpose of racial gaslighting white people is to send a message to other white people. And this message is essentially to reinforce and teach white people from an early age not to recover our own or their own humanity. So if you look at the table along the left-hand side, we have the different sort of components of racial gaslighting as a process. And I want to just give you a quick example of how this works in the workplace. The one thing on the table I just want to point out that you may not understand is exposure. And exposure just means what is the level of risk, right, that is involved in this particular process, in this incident, if we will. Okay. So I'm going to just present you with an academic workplace scenario that could be replicated in many different workplace contexts, since I know most of you are not necessarily from academia. All right. So a department chair named Steve repeatedly racially gaslighted a Black woman faculty member named May by saying he didn't understand her research and asked her questions in private about why Black students had names that began with LA prefixes. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what he was asking. Steve also asked May to continually justify her degree and mentioned that she was a mother in the program assessment documents, which is both irrelevant and inappropriate in our workplace. He also harassed her based on her pregnancy status by calling her, quote, larger than a house, and saying she might, quote, float away. A white woman faculty member named Laura witnessed some of these acts of racial gaslighting in particular, and after consulting with May, sought resolution through various administrative channels, including mediation. Steve, who's the chair, then asked Laura, the white woman faculty member, why she was, quote, the defender of all things Black, end quote, and attempted later to downgrade her ratings on her annual performance review, in addition to continuing to make inappropriate comments. He did continue to praise Laura's research, however, ostensibly because her research on race was somehow, quote unquote, neutral. So in this case, you can see how the targeting of May for racial gaslighting was based on familiar racist stereotypes that not only target her specifically, but reinforced general racist stereotypes about students, for example. The pathologization was primarily collective, and the audience included both BIPOC people and white people in the department. The outcome was individual and institutional continued punishment and symbolic messages sent to May. Now you can compare Laura's experience with as a whistleblower, which was essentially focused on her being an obsessive individual, right? So the obsessive piece here is that's the piece where how white people are portrayed, right? Obsessive. Who did suffer some individual punishment, but was also attempted to be contained and co-opted by continual praise. All right, I'll turn it back to Angelique.
Okay, thank you. So let's now talk about framework for responding. And this is based upon some research that we did and then our own research as well. So we're integrating into the 4D framework is what we're calling it. So there's 4 components: discern, disarm, defy, and decide. Okay, and so when we talk about discern, and these can be used interchangeably, and this is a skill set that develops over time, right? So that this process can happen faster. But like I was talking about in the beginning, often, and what we're doing today in the group that I'm leading with BIPOC individuals is really practicing this skill set, right? So that it can go from sometimes being a slower process to one that you can do within seconds in thinking about how to respond. So first of all, discerning, right? The importance of the issue and the relationship, thinking about your feelings and how you want to be perceived now and in the future, and quite honestly, if you even care. Disarming, right? So first of all, making the invisible visible, okay? You might want to give a warning, explain the conversation is about to get uncomfortable, but what they just did or said was also uncomfortable to you. Or you could invite them to sit alongside you to, get to the root of their behavior. Another one is to defy. So by asking probing questions, like, how do you mean that, right? Reframe what they're saying around the impact instead of focusing on the intent. And then also deciding, okay? So deciding what's this gonna mean for your life and your work. So deciding if you want to engage, right? What will you take from the interaction? What will you allow for it to take from you? And whether or not you need external reinforcement or support. So right now we'd like to ask Siobhan Neela Stock to speak briefly before we get into our small groups. She wrote an article in Mashable about how to recognize if you're being racially gaslighted. And we want to just invite her to talk about what drew her to this topic and writing the article and how she thought it was useful. Siobhan?
Hi, so like Angelique said, I wrote an article for Mashable. I'm a reporter for Mashable. I'm a social good reporter, so I report on social justice issues. And can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. So I was really drawn to this topic because of what's going on in this country with the after the police killing of George Floyd and the anti-police brutality protests that came up. But racial gaslighting, even though I didn't realize it, has happened to me my entire life. I just didn't have a word for it. I didn't know that there was a term for it. So kind of the most prominent example I can give you is my whole life I've been asked, where are you from? Which may seem like an innocuous question, but for me as a person of color who was adopted by a white family and lived in a predominantly white state my whole life, Vermont, I've always been asked this, and I always had a nagging sense that it was wrong in a way. And I finally was able to, for years of being asked it, identify why it's wrong, because it basically sends a message to me that I'm an outsider, right? Even though it seems like on its head, it's kind of an innocent question. So I wanted to explore my experience, but also other people's experience, because I'm pretty light-skinned. So for my sisters who are darker skinned, they've dealt with a lot worse than I have when it comes to racism and racial gaslighting, and kind of frame it in the moment we find ourselves in, where people, sorry about that, are kind of rising up against white supremacy, against racism. And so I saw Angelique's and Rose's paper, and I decided it'd be most helpful if I could tell people how you can recognize racial gaslighting in your everyday life. So I found it kind of helpful for me because even though I've kind of come up with some defenses against racial gaslighting, sometimes I would get flustered and I wouldn't know exactly what to say, or sometimes I didn't know if I should say something. So that's how that came about.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. We really appreciate you sharing that. I think it's one of those things, right? It's this diversionary tactic. So that's why we're here. So we can get to work on the things that are important to us, right? And not spend time dealing with these side issues. So we're all here because we care about dismantling and interrupting racism, right? And particularly figuring out strategies, right, to respond and recognize racial gaslighting. So, and as Rose discussed earlier, racial gaslighting functions differently for BIPOC people than it does for white people. So at this junction of the webinar, we're going to break into groups in order to gain the ability to engage in deeper discussion. And so we've talked about how to recognize it. Now we're going to get into how to respond. And of course, your response depends on whether you're a target of racial gaslighting, you're a bystander, or you're a white anti-racist ally, right? So we're going to use a long-standing practice of racial caucusing and divide into two groups. So for the BIPOC participants who are targets and bystanders, I'm going to facilitate that group. And for the white anti-racist allies, who are often those who gaslight or bystanders who'd like to interrupt, that will be facilitated by Rose. So it's going to take me a moment to divide everyone into groups. So this is the perfect time for you to go ahead and take a quick bathroom break, grab some more tea or coffee, and I'll go ahead and be breaking into groups, and it'll take just a moment for it to transfer. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. We'll do our work in the groups for until about 5 till the hour. So we're going to spend the next hour working through these topics, and then we'll come back together briefly to debrief. So thank you, and we'll go ahead and take this short break while I go ahead and assign us to our groups.